The warrant hit the sheriff's desk with a sound like a judge's gavel, and Micah Winslow read it twice before he looked up at the rider who had delivered it. The man was a crown courier, lean and dust-bitten, wearing the bronze badge of the territorial authority on his chest like it was something to be proud of. He stood in the doorway of the wayhouse at Cradle's Pass with his arms crossed and his chin lifted, as though the altitude alone required arrogance. "Bula Bonecrusher," Micah said, reading the name from the warrant aloud. He set it flat on the table. "This says she's wanted for what exactly?" "Destruction of crown property, resisting lawful arrest, and suspected conspiracy against the peace of the Thornwall territories." He looked up. "Any of that substantiated, or is this one of Commissioner Halsey's personal vendettas dressed up in wax and ribbon?" The courier's jaw tightened. "The commissioner's warrants are not personal. They're law. Halsey's warrants are whatever Halsey needs them to be on any given morning." Micah stood, pushing back from the table. He was a broad man, not tall by any exceptional measure, but solid in the way that stone was solid. A quiet durability that came from years of hard physical work rather than any particular vanity. His face was weathered and honest, the face of a man who had spent the last 6 years stationed at the Thornwall lighthouse on the Cape's farthest headland, keeping the beacon burning through gales that would snap a lesser man in half. He wasn't accustomed to political niceties, and he didn't pretend otherwise. "I'm the acting sheriff of Cradle's Pass for the duration of the autumn Pilgrim Road season. That makes this warrant my jurisdiction." "Then your jurisdiction is required to execute it," the courier said. Micah folded the warrant in half, slid it inside his coat, and reached for his hat from the hook beside the door. "I'll look into it," he said, in a tone that meant he would look into it on his own terms. He stepped out into the cold gray morning. The Pilgrim Road was not a gentle stretch of highway. It was 50 miles of packed stone and broken switchbacks that wound from the lowland port of Ashfin up through the Thornwall Range to the high pass shrine of the Seven Bones, where pilgrims came every autumn to make their petitions before the passes snowed in for winter. The road was old, older than the crown, lined with small stone shrines every few miles and broken at irregular intervals by wayhouses that served as inns, trading posts, and rudimentary courts of order. Bandits loved it. Merchants endured it. Pilgrims suffered it gladly, because suffering the road was supposed to be part of the penance. For the last 3 weeks, Micah had been posted at the Cradle's Pass wayhouse as acting sheriff, because the regular sheriff had broken his leg falling from a horse in a manner that no one felt was appropriately dignified to describe in official records. It was supposed to be a temporary posting. Micah had been about to return to the lighthouse for winter. His lantern-keeper's kit was still packed. He had walked perhaps 50 yards from the wayhouse door when he saw her. She was standing at the edge of the road where it curved around a granite outcropping, pressed against the stone in a way that suggested she knew how to use the landscape for cover. She was watching the wayhouse, watching the courier's horse tied at the post, watching the road north and south with quick, intelligent eyes. She was armed, a short-hafted axe at her hip, a long hunting knife at her thigh, and she wore travel leathers that were shaped to her rather than merely draped over her. A fitted bodice of dark oiled leather, laced tightly at the front with heavy cord, over a deep green long-sleeved tunic that clung to the lines of her shoulders and waist before tucking into high-riding trousers of the same oiled leather, with the knife thigh strapped at the outside seam. The bodice had been worked with carved ridges along the ribs that served as reinforcement, and the overall effect was armor that didn't announce itself as armor, clothing that moved with her instead of restricting her. She was green-skinned, with the deep olive to emerald tone of a mountain orc, and her lower tusks curved upward from her jaw, not the exaggerated ivory horns of old human caricatures, but elegant, real, a natural part of a face that was fierce and striking and in the cold autumn light genuinely beautiful. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical braid, threaded through with a thin cord of red, which was either a fashion choice or a clan marker or both. She was looking directly at him. She had, he realized, been watching him since he stepped out the door, Micah stopped walking. He put his hands out slightly from his sides, not reaching for anything, just showing her the posture of a man who wasn't moving fast or reaching for a weapon. "Bula Bonecrusher," he said, low enough that it wouldn't carry back to the wayhouse door. Her chin came up. Not fear, something sharper. Wariness and calculation. "You read fast," she said. Her voice was low and controlled, with the faint cadence of someone who had learned the common tongue as a second language but had spoken it long enough that only the rhythm remained. "Where are you sending me?" "I haven't decided," he said honestly. That seemed to surprise her more than a confident answer would have. She studied him, and he let her, standing still in the road while the morning wind off the thorn wall pushed cold against his back. "You're the sheriff," she said. "Acting sheriff. There's a difference, mostly in pay." "The warrant says destruction of crown property," she said. "You want to know what I destroyed?" "I assumed you'd tell me if you wanted to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "A detention cage, at the Ashfin docks. They had 12 orc workers locked in it waiting to be shipped to the Crestfall quarries. Contract labor." She said the last two words the way a person says a polite name for something unspeakable. "The contracts were signed by men who had never spoken to the people named on them. I cut the lock and I told them to run." She held his gaze. "That is the destruction of crown property. I'm the conspiracy against the peace." Micah looked at her for a long time. The wind moved the hem of her tunic and rattled a loose stone shrine lantern somewhere behind him. "The courier's inside," he said. "He's going to eat his breakfast and leave inside the hour. The road north runs past the wayhouse. The road south curves behind that rock." He didn't point, he just said it. "Heading south puts you toward Ashfin, but also toward the Ridge Fork Path, which takes you up through the goat pastures toward the high wayhouse at Setter's Nook. It's a slower road, but it doesn't pass another crown post until Delmark, which is 4 days walking." She stared at him. "Or," he said, "you could come inside and have breakfast. The courier will be gone in an hour. I'm not currently planning to arrest anyone." He paused. "Unless you give me an actual reason to." She uncrossed her arms. She studied him like she was reading a contract written in a language she was almost sure she understood. Then she said, "If this is a trap, I will make your life very difficult." "It is extremely not a trap," Micah said. "I also genuinely need someone to help me understand a supply manifest that's been bothering me for 3 days, and you look like someone who's traveled this road before." Her eyes narrowed. "That is an absurd thing to say to a fugitive." "I contain multitudes," Micah said, and turned back toward the wayhouse. He heard her boot hit the road stone behind him after a pause of only a few seconds. He seated her at the back corner table, away from the window where the courier could see the road, and he asked the wayhouse keeper's wife, a round, uncomplicated woman named Dora who had long since stopped being startled by unusual guests, to bring 2 bowls of the morning porridge, and whatever bread was left from yesterday. The courier was at the front table with his back to the room, eating and ignoring everything. Bula Bonecrusher sat with her back against the wall and watched everything anyway. "How long have you been on the road?" Micah asked, keeping his voice below the room's ambient noise. 3 weeks, she said. "Since Ashfin." 3 weeks on the Pilgrim Road in autumn with a crown worn out was not nothing. That was hard, dangerous travel, and she had made it 50 miles up into the Thornwall Range without being caught or killed. He noted that without commenting on it. "Where were you heading?" he asked. "The High Pass. There is a monastery beyond the 7 Bones Shrine. They take people in." She said it without particular emotion, as though she had long since processed whatever that option meant about her circumstances. "The monks of the Silent Way don't usually involve themselves in territorial law," he agreed. "But the passes will snow in within a month, maybe 3 weeks if that storm front holds." He looked at her. "You could make it if the weather holds." "I know," she said. "I had a plan." "Had," he said. She looked at him steadily. "A crown courier delivered to the only sheriff's post between here and the High Pass. I have revised my timeline." The courier stood, scraped his chair, and dropped coins on the front table without counting them. He pulled on his riding gloves, cast one professional and entirely uninterested look around the room, and walked out. They heard his horse's hooves on the stone road moving north, growing faint. Bula watched the window until the sound was gone. "He's heading north," Micah said. "Away from you." She turned back to him. Something in her posture changed, not relaxing exactly, but reallocating. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Micah picked up his spoon. "Because a detention cage at the Ashford docks is crown property in the way that a gun aimed at someone is still technically just property." He ate for a moment. "And because Halsey's been running that quarry supply operation for 2 years, and everyone along this road knows it's not voluntary, and not one person in a Crown uniform has done a single thing about it." He looked up. "So I read the warrant, and I decided it was not the kind of warrant I was in the business of executing." She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully parse. Not gratitude exactly. Something more careful than that, as though gratitude was something she had learned to offer slowly and only after significant verification. "You will lose your post," she said. "Acting post," he said. "I was going back to the lighthouse in 3 days anyway." "The lighthouse?" "On the Cape, South Headland below Ashford. I keep the beacon." He shrugged one shoulder. "It is a singular and very quiet life, and I am generally suited for it." She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of something that might have been recognition, the kind that happens not between faces but between temperaments. "A man who keeps a light," she said, "alone on a headland. It has its recommendations," he said, "such as—" "No one gives you warrants to execute," he said, and she laughed. It was abrupt and genuine and surprised her as much as it surprised him, a real sound that she pulled back almost immediately, pressing her mouth into a controlled line. But it had been real for that moment, full and warm, and it changed the quality of the room's air. He felt it. He was careful not to let that show. They ate, and she told him more about the road, and he told her what he knew about the current bandit activity between Cradle's Pass and Setter's Nook, which was considerable. There were 3 organized road crews working the Pilgrim Road this season, the Fenwick brothers operating out of the old watchtower ruins at the 6-mile mark, a loose collective of former soldiers calling themselves the Grey Toll, and a more fluid group operating near the high pass that the Pilgrims had taken to calling the Black Rooks, mostly because of the way they appeared and disappeared from the rocks. "I've seen all 3, Bula said. "Avoided them." "Mostly," she said, and there was something in the word that suggested the exceptions had been instructive. He looked at the muscle of her jaw, the easy set of her hands, the way the axe at her hip was worn smooth at the handle from real use, not ceremony. "I imagine they were less trouble after you'd seen them," he said. "One was," she agreed. They sat for a while in something that was not quite comfortable silence but was closer to it than Micah had expected. He was used to silence. He lived inside it for most of the year, listening to the wind off the Cape and the long, slow turn of the lighthouse beacon. He had few visitors, fewer still who stayed. There was something about a person who could sit in silence without trying to fill it that he found instinctively trustworthy. When she stood to go, he felt the room change in a way he didn't have a name for yet. "The Ridge Fork path forks again at the second goat pasture," he said before she could speak. "The right branch looks like the main trail, but it loops back toward the road. You want the left branch. It's narrower, but it's the right one." He paused. "And the Grey Toll has been working the approach to Setter's Nook. They usually sit it between midday and dusk." She looked at him steadily. "You know this road very well for a lighthouse keeper." "I've been here 3 weeks," he said. "I pay attention." She nodded once. Then she said, "Micah Winslow." He hadn't told her his name. It was on the sheriff's badge pinned inside his coat, which was hanging on the door hook with the badge facing inward, as he often wore it when he was eating. "I read fast too," she said, and she walked out. He sat for a long time after, listening to the empty room and the sound of the wind coming down from the thorn wall. 3 days later, a winter storm came in from the northeast that was 2 weeks early by any almanac in the territory, and Micah Winslow was still at Cradle's Pass, because the road south to the lighthouse cape was flooded. iced at the switchbacks, and altogether impassable until the weather broke. He was stranded at the way house with Dora, her husband Pell, 3 pilgrims too afraid to continue their journey, a traveling merchant named Corvin, and on the evening of the second storm day, Bula Bonecrusher. She came in from the north side, from the direction of Setter's Nook, which meant she had made it to the high way house and come back, which in this weather was a remarkable feat of either stubbornness or desperation. She pushed through the way house door in a billow of sleet and wind, and Dora made a small, involuntary sound and stepped back, because Dora's world was small and did not routinely include armed orc women arriving through blizzards. Bula ignored Dora's alarm with the practiced patience of someone who had spent a lifetime being alarming to people who hadn't bothered to think carefully about their assumptions. She unwrapped the wool scarf from around her head, shook the ice from it, and looked at the room until she found Micah. He was standing from the table before he'd consciously decided to. "Setter's Nook," he said. "The Grey Toll took it 3 days ago," she said. "They've got the wayhouse keeper locked in his own cellar, and they're running a toll operation on the high road." She came further into the room past Dora, and her eyes catalogued everyone in it with the automatic thoroughness of someone who had been surviving in hostile environments long enough to make assessment an unconscious habit. "I got close enough to count. 14 men. The merchant Corvin went pale. The pilgrims murmured among themselves. "The passes," said one of the pilgrims, a young man with an amulet of the 7 bones around his neck. "We have to get through before they close." "You don't have to get through anything right now," Micah said firmly, "because there is a serious storm outside that does not care about any of our schedules." He looked at Bula. He didn't ask why she'd come back. He thought he might understand it well enough that asking would feel like making her say something she wasn't ready to say. "You're staying until the weather breaks." It wasn't a question. She looked at him, and something passed between them that wasn't argument and wasn't agreement, but was its own third thing, an acknowledgement between 2 people who were both too sensible and too honest to waste energy on unnecessary posturing. "I'll need a room," she said. Dora found her one. It was small and cold and shared a thin wall with Micah's room, which was also small and cold. This was the nature of the Cradle's Pass way house, which had been built for function rather than comfort at a time when the two were considered largely incompatible. That night, the storm hammered the building like something personal. The shutters rattled, the roof beam creaked, and the fire in the common room was the only warmth in the building that could be relied upon. Micah sat up late tending it, feeding it carefully, because the wood supply was finite and the storm seemed inclined to last. He heard her door open, around the 2nd hour after midnight. She came into the common room in stockinged feet, her tunic untucked, the bodice loosened at its lacing so it hung open over the green shirt beneath, not immodest, but casual, private, the way a person dresses when they're not expecting to be seen. She stopped when she saw him at the fireplace. "I thought you were asleep," she said. "I'm not a good sleeper in strange places," he said. "Sit down if you want, there's room." She sat on the hearthstone. Not across the fire from him, but beside it, close enough that the warmth reached both of them. He watched the fire. She watched the fire. After a while she said, "The monks' monastery won't take the passes in this weather either." "No," he agreed. "I had nowhere else to go," she said. "I want you to understand I came back because the situation at Setter's Nook needs to be addressed, and I thought you should know about it. Not because She stopped. "Of course," he said, with a careful neutrality that he was surprised to find he was faking. She turned and looked at him in the firelight, and he had the sense of being very directly and very thoroughly examined. He didn't look away. He was a lighthouse keeper. He was accustomed to keeping his bearing in difficult conditions. "You're not afraid of me," she said, not really a question. "No," he said, "most people are. Most people haven't thought about it long enough to get past the immediate reaction." He fed a small branch into the fire. "I've been up on that headland for 6 years. In that time, the things that actually threatened my life were all weather or the sea or my own poor decision-making on an icy staircase. No orc ever came to blow out my light." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, with something that sounded almost like testing the words, "And if one had?" "Then I'd have had an interesting conversation," he said, "same as any other circumstance." The fire cracked and spat a small ember that faded on the hearthstone between them. She was watching his profile, and he could feel the weight of that attention, warm and specific, and not entirely like anything he'd felt directed at him before. "You have a very inconvenient personality," she said, "for someone I'm supposed to distrust." "I imagine that's frustrating," he agreed. She made a short sound that was almost but not quite the laugh from the first morning and looked back at the fire. They sat together in the firelight for another hour, talking in low voices about nothing in particular. The lighthouse, the road, the geography of the Thornwall Range that she knew well from years of travel across Orcish clan territories that ran along the mountain's eastern spine. She had been born in a clan camp in the high valleys. She told him, matter-of-factly and without sentiment, the way you describe a landscape rather than a wound. She had left the clan at 18, after a leadership dispute that she described with notable economy of detail, and had spent the years since as a road trader, a guide, and occasionally a person who corrected injustices that other people were content to ignore. The detention cage at Ashfin had been the most recent correction, and the most costly. He told her about the lighthouse, about the way the beacon's rotation threw its light across the water in a rhythm you could feel through the walls of the lantern room, about the winter storms that came in off the gray sea and made the tower shudder to its foundation while he climbed the stairs to check the trim of the flame, about the way silence at the lighthouse was a different quality of silence than silence anywhere else, full instead of empty, the silence of a thing that is doing exactly the work it is meant to do. She listened to all of this with her chin in her hand and her eyes on the fire, and at the end she said quietly, "That sounds like the first thing you've described that you genuinely love." He thought about denying it. He didn't. "Yes," he said. She looked at him then, sidelong firelight catching the green of her skin and the pale curves of her tusks and the dark intelligence of her eyes. Something in his chest did something unannounced and inconvenient. He looked back at the fire. "I should sleep," she said, but didn't move immediately. "Probably," he agreed. She stood eventually, tugged her tunic straight and looked down at him still seated on the hearthstone. "Micah Winslow," she said, in a tone that was neither dismissal nor farewell but something in between. "Good night, Bula Bonecrusher," he said. She went back to her room and he sat with the fire until it burned down to coals. The storm lasted 4 days. On the third day, 2 things happened. Corvin the merchant, in a fit of commercial practicality, revealed that he had been carrying a case of documented trade contracts to the settlers' Nook Wayhouse, and that the gray toll holding the Wayhouse had specifically sent word to pilgrims on the road that they would not guarantee anyone's safety past the 6-mile marker. This was, as Micah pointed out, both extortion and a violation of the Pilgrim Road Charter, which was one of 3 documents that the Crown actually enforced with any consistency, because breaking the charter cost them too much in lost pilgrimage revenue. "You're going to go up there," Bula said. She was sitting across the table from him in the common room, and the statement was not a question. She had that look again, the calculating one, reading him like a contract. "Someone should address it before the storm breaks and more pilgrims come up the road into it," he said. 14 men, she said. "I know. You are 1 man. I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are an inexhaustible source of poor tactical thinking." "Thank you. I am coming with you," she said. He looked at her. He thought about saying she didn't have to, that this wasn't her problem, that she was a fugitive with a crown warrant, and walking into a conflict with 14 armed men would multiply her risk substantially. He thought about all of that and weighed it against the look on her face, which was not the look of someone offering, but the look of someone stating a fact. "The storm should ease tomorrow morning," he said. "We go at first light." They left at first light. The road to Setter's Nook was 6 miles of ice stone and drifted snow, that the storm had made considerably more miserable. They walked it in the gray pre-dawn, Micah in his sheriff's coat with the badge now facing outward, Bula at his left with her axe free at her hip, and her long stride eating the distance at a pace he had to work to match. She was quiet and focused on the road, moving with an efficiency that reminded him of the lighthouse in winter, nothing wasted, everything deliberate. At the 4-mile marker, she put a hand flat on his chest without looking at him, and he stopped. She had heard something in the trees above the road that he hadn't. She tilted her head, reading the sound, and then said quietly, "2 of them. Scout pair above and left." She paused. "They saw us when we rounded the last turn." "Do they know who I am?" he said. "They know what your badge looks like," she said, "which is either going to help or make things significantly worse." "Story of this badge's entire career," he murmured, and she shot him a brief look that in other circumstances might have been a smile. He called up to the trees. "Cradles Pass Acting Sheriff. I'm here to discuss the situation at Setter's Nook Way House. No weapons drawn, no threats made. I'd like to talk to whoever's in charge." A long silence. Then a voice from the trees. "Keep walking, you're expected." The Setter's Nook Way House was a larger establishment than Cradles Pass, a 2-story stone building with a stable attached, and a yard enclosed on 3 sides by a low wall. It looked, in the aftermath of the storm, like a photograph of a place preparing for a long siege. Men with crossbows on the 2nd-floor windows. A fire in the yard with 4 more men around it. A man standing in the yard's center with the casual authority of a commander who had arranged this scene specifically to be read as commanding. He was a big man, gray-haired, with a soldier's bearing and the kind of face that had decided a long time ago that the world owed it more than it had paid. He looked at Micah with professional contempt and then let his eyes travel to Bula with a different kind of attention, one that had assessment and greed in equal parts. "The orc," he said. "You must be the Bonecrusher woman. There's a warrant." "I'm aware," Bula said pleasantly. "I'm Sheriff Winslow," Micah said with absolute calm. "And the Pilgrim Road Charter gives this Wayhouse's keeper certain protections that you are currently in violation of. I'd like to discuss terms for an orderly resolution before more pilgrims come up the road, and this becomes a larger problem than it is currently." "There's 1 of you," the Gray Toll commander said. "And 14 of you," Micah agreed. "So I'm hoping we can do this without making it physical, because the math on that is not compelling." What happened next moved fast. It moved, in fact, so fast that Micah would reconstruct the sequence afterward primarily from what Bula told him, because in the moment it was all reflex and reaction, and the animal instinct of a body trained by 6 years of maritime emergencies. One of the crossbowmen on the 2nd-floor window made a decision that his commander had not authorized, aimed at Bula because she was the obvious threat, and fired. Bula moved. She caught the bolt on the inside of her forearm. It grazed the leather of her bodice's reinforced rib panel and skidded off rather than burying itself, but it spun her half around from the impact. Micah grabbed her arm before she could fully react and pulled her behind the well housing in the yard's corner, which was stone, and therefore substantially more useful than either of them individually. Then the yard erupted. It was not, in Micah's retrospective assessment, the sort of midnight raid he had read about in the territorial dispatches. It was not organized or tactical in any way that could be called military. What it was chaos, and in chaos, he had learned over years of emergency management at a lighthouse that the person who kept their head and kept moving purposefully tended to be the one who was still present at the end of it. He kept his head. Bula kept the yard. She came over the well housing like water over a rock, fluid and fast, and she hit the nearest 2 men before they had finished the first movement of reaching for their weapons. She fought the way she walked, nothing wasted, everything deliberate, with the short axe in her right hand and the hunting knife appearing in her left as though it had always been there. She was not trying to kill anyone. She was trying to make being between her and the door so extremely unpleasant that rational people would step aside. Most of them did. Two of them needed additional persuasion. Micah dealt with the commander. He was a lighthouse keeper, not a soldier. He had the sheriff's badge and the physical build of a man who had hauled machinery up a spiral stair in gale-force winds for 6 years. And he had been in enough waterfront brawls in his younger years to understand the essential economics of a confrontation. Find the center of it and put that center on the ground. He found the gray toll commander going for the sword at his hip, got there first, and applied the leverage of a man who was taller than he looked and very significantly angrier than he appeared. The commander went down. He stayed down. He was not dead. He was, however, finished making decisions for the day. The two crossbowmen on the second floor looked down at the yard and made what Micah would later describe as an extremely sensible career evaluation. Both crossbows lowered simultaneously. The wayhouse keeper was in the cellar exactly where Bula had said he'd be, unhurt but shaken. A compact older man named Taryn who wept with relief when they opened the trapdoor. The gray toll, disorganized without their commander, and facing the immediate reality that a large orc woman with an axe and a sheriff's badge were standing in their yard, and neither appeared to be going anywhere, dispersed with remarkable efficiency. Most of them were over the north wall before Micah had finished helping Taryn up the cellar stairs. The three who stayed younger men, frightened, the ones who had not quite managed to decide whether to run, Micah formally detained, disarmed, and sat against the wayhouse's outer wall with their hands bound in front of them with rope from the stable. He would arrange for their transport to the Crown Post at Delmark, once the road was passable. The commander he added to this group, once the man was conscious enough to understand his situation. Taryn made a fire in the hearth and tea in a battered pot, and the two of them sat at the wayhouse table in the aftermath, while the bound men sat outside, and the road stayed empty. Bula's forearm had a long welt along it from the crossbow bolt's graze, livid green-purple against her darker skin, which she examined with the detached curiosity of someone cataloging damage that belonged to someone else. "Let me see it," Micah said. She looked at him. "I have a medicine kit," he said. "I'm a lighthouse keeper. We're very thorough about first aid." She extended her arm across the table without comment. He unwrapped the thin oilcloth kit, found the salve, and began cleaning the welt carefully. Her skin was warm and the welt was real. The bolt had skidded off the bodice's reinforced panel, but the impact had still been significant. He worked carefully, not hurrying, and she sat very still. "That was brave," she said eventually. "What was?" "Coming up here with one badge and no backup." He glanced up. "I wasn't alone." Something moved across her face that she controlled before he could fully read it. She looked down at her arm and he looked back at the welt, and the fire crackled between them and outside the window. The Thornwall Range was white and silent under its new coat of storm snow, and everything was very quiet. His thumb moved across the edge of the welt, checking that the salve was seated properly, and he felt her arm go very still under his hands, not tense, but something as though she had stopped breathing for a moment. He finished, wrapped the arm in clean linen, and tied it off. When he looked up, she was watching him with those dark eyes that had been cataloging and calculating since he'd first seen her against the granite outcropping, and for the first time, what he saw in them was not calculation at all. He let go of her arm. Neither of them spoke. Taryn came back with the tea, and the moment was archived but not gone. The road back to Cradle's Pass was easier with the storm spent. The sky had come clean and blue-edged, and the snow on the road was crusted hard, crunching underfoot in a way that was almost cheerful. They walked side by side, close enough that their arms occasionally touched, and neither of them moved away from those touches. At the second shrine marker, a small stone alcove with a carved figure of a pilgrim holding an unlit lantern, she stopped. He stopped too. She turned and looked at him fully and said without preamble, "I need to tell you something." "All right," he said. "The men who put out the warrant," she said. "Halsey and the quarry operation. It's not just Ashvin." She paused. "There are 3 others on the road who are part of the same network. One of them is a Crown Post commander at the Delmark station." They will know, eventually, that a warrant was delivered to Cradle's Pass and not executed. They will send someone with more authority than a courier. I know, he said. When they do, she said, the warrant will come with names on it. Mine, certainly. Possibly yours if they decide a sheriff who did not execute a valid warrant is complicit. She held his gaze. I'm telling you this because you should be able to make a real decision about what you're doing, not a decision made without information. He stood in the road in the winter light and thought about it carefully. He thought about the lighthouse, and the way the beacon looked from the sea, a fixed and reliable point in a dark and unreliable world. He thought about the 6 pilgrims who were going to come up this road in the next 2 weeks if someone didn't deal with the gray toll and the other operations preying on them. He thought about 12 orc workers in a cage at the Ashfin docks. He thought about the woman standing in front of him, who had come back through a blizzard to warn him about a problem she had every reason to avoid getting involved in, and who was now watching him with her chin level and her expression carefully neutral, giving him room to make his choice without the pressure of her wanting him to make a particular one. I've made my decision, he said. I made it when I read the warrant and didn't like what it said. She searched his face. You understand what that means? Yes, a pause, the wind moved the red cord in her braid. I don't need protecting, she said. I want you to understand that I'm not asking you to put yourself at risk for me. I know you don't need protecting, he said. I'm not doing it for protection. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do and because he stopped. He looked at her. He said the next part only half deciding too. And because I have not had a good reason to care about anything on this road until 3 days ago, and I find I am not interested in pretending otherwise. The silence was very particular. She closed the distance between them 2 steps, her boots on the crusted snow, the hem of her oiled leather bodice at the level of his sternum, and she took his face in both her hands. Her hands were warm, larger than his, strong in a way that was not rough but absolute, and she held him as carefully as he had held her arm. She looked at him for a long moment, up close, the tusk curves of her lower jaw at the edges of his vision, her breath making small white clouds in the cold air. Then she kissed him, not tentatively. She didn't do anything tentatively. It was warm and real and absolute like the grip of her hands, and he kissed her back, and the cold Thornwall air and the shrine lantern and the distant sound of pilgrims coming up the road from below were all present and entirely irrelevant. When she pulled back, she was still holding his face. For someone I was supposed to arrest, he said with some difficulty, you are very hard to be professionally detached about. I noticed you stopped trying, she said. Days ago, he admitted. She lowered her hands but didn't step back, and they stood in the road with the shrine between them and the mountain above and the road ahead, very close in the winter light. What do we do now? She asked. We go back to Cradle's Pass, he said, and I write a very thorough and carefully worded report to the territorial commissioner, the real one, not Halsey, about the gray toll situation, the Setter's Nook detention, and the irregularities in the Ashfin quarry labor contracts. I have been composing it in my head for 3 weeks. He paused. And then we figure out the rest. She studied him. You have been composing a report. I pay attention, he said. She shook her head slowly, in the way people do when confronted with someone who is exactly what they appear to be, which is either the most trustworthy or the most confounding thing in the world, depending on your experience with people. She started walking. He walked beside her. At the end of the day, they were back at Cradle's Pass and the road below was beginning to clear. The report took 2 days to write. It was thorough. Micah had a precise and methodical mind that had been sharpened by years of maintaining lighthouse logs in which accuracy was a matter of maritime safety. And he applied that same precision to 6 pages of documentation covering the quarry labor network, the Gray Tolls extortion operation, the attempted shooting at the Setter's Nook yard, and with notable care, the question of the warrant for Bula Bonecrusher, which he characterized as legally inconsistent, factually unsupported, and procedurally suspicious given the documented interests of Commissioner Halsey in the quarry contracts that she had disrupted. He sent 2 copies of the report, one to the Territorial Commission office at the Capitol, and one to a magistrate at the Delmark Post whose name appeared in the Pilgrim Road Charter records as a charter oversight officer, and who was therefore unlikely to be in Halsey's pocket, since charter oversight officers were appointed by a different branch of territorial governance specifically to avoid that kind of interference. Then he pulled out the warrant for Bula Bonecrusher, read it one more time, walked to the Wayhouse fireplace and dropped it into the flames. He stood and watched it go. The paper curled at the edges first, then the wax seal melted and ran, and then the whole thing was gone in a small, clean bloom of orange light. The warrant was real and properly signed and backed by the authority of Commissioner Halsey's office, which made what he had just done either a principled act of official misconduct or a righteous refusal, depending entirely on who was going to be reviewing his record in approximately 6 weeks' time. He was aware of both possibilities. He felt no significant regret either way. Bula was standing in the common room doorway. She had seen him do it. She was looking at him with an expression that had something in it he hadn't seen there before. It wasn't gratitude and it wasn't surprise, although it had elements of both. It was something deeper than either recognition, perhaps. The kind of recognition that happens not between faces but between the deepest and most carefully guarded parts of a person, the parts that have waited a long time to encounter something that actually matches them. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "The report already addressed it." "I know," he said. "Then why?" He looked at the fire. "Because a warrant has a person's name on it, and burning it is something a person can see happen and know that it has happened." He looked at her. "And because you should be able to see it." She was very still for a moment. Then she crossed the room and she kissed him again, harder this time, both hands at his face and her body against him, the warmth of her a considerable and welcome fact, and he put his arms around her and held on, and this time neither of them was in a hurry to stop. When they finally separated, he was fairly certain his face was a readable map of every thought he'd failed to suppress for the last week, which was embarrassing and also not something he could do anything about. She looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of a smile and said, "The lighthouse. What about it? You said there was room in the keeper's quarters." She was watching him with that precise and direct attention that stripped away every conversational hedge. "Is there?" He thought about the lighthouse, the 2 small rooms behind the lantern stair, the view from the lantern room in the morning when the sea turned gold, the sound of the wind in the tower walls on a winter night, and what all of those things would feel like with someone else in them. "Yes," he said, "there is." Getting to the lighthouse from Cradle's Pass required waiting for the South Road to fully clear, which took another 5 days. In those 5 days, Micah finished his official duties as acting sheriff by documenting the Setter's Nook situation in a formal incident report, arranging for the 4 detained men to be transported to Delmark by a Crown courier who arrived, a different courier from the first one, younger, with a more flexible attitude toward complicated situations, and formally closing the Cradle's Pass Wayhouse posting in his own logs. He wrote one additional document, which was not part of any official ledger. It was a formal statement of his own, addressed to the Territorial Commission, recording that on the date of delivery, he had reviewed and declined to execute the warrant for one Bula Bonecrusher, on grounds of procedural irregularity and unsupported factual basis, and that in his professional judgment as the acting sheriff of record, the warrant had been improperly issued. He signed it with his full name and his badge number and his 6-year service record at the Thornwall Lighthouse, which was impeccable, because lighthouse keeping was not a position that permitted professional lapses. He gave Bula the second copy of this document. She read it twice as she had watched him read the warrant. Then she folded it and put it inside her fitted bodice close against her ribs and looked at him with something that he was fairly certain was the most unguarded expression he had seen on her face. "This puts you on record," she said. "Yes," he said, "intentionally. They may pursue it." "They may," he said. But a lighthouse keeper with 6 years of impeccable service challenging a warrant on procedural grounds is a different kind of problem for Halsey than a fugitive. It's the kind of problem that survives legal scrutiny. He paused. "I've thought about it carefully." "I know you have," she said. "I know you think about everything carefully." There was something in her voice that was different from the controlled assessment she usually offered him, warmer, rougher, as though it was coming from somewhere less defended. "It is very—" She stopped, tried again. "I am not accustomed to people thinking carefully on my behalf." "You should be," he said simply. She pressed her mouth together, not suppressing a laugh this time but something more substantial, and she looked away and then back, and then she said, "Stop being like that." "Like what?" "Like that," she said, with a gesture that encompassed him entirely, and he thought that might be the finest thing anyone had said to him in some time. They left for the lighthouse on a clear morning with the frost still on the road stones and the smell of coming winter sharp in the air. She carried her pack and her axe and the hunting knife at her thigh and the folded document inside her bodice, and he carried his lighthouse kit and the 2 wool blankets he'd supplemented at the weighhouse, because the lighthouse quarters were drafty in the cold months, and he'd been meaning to add blankets for 2 years. The road south was long and descended through mixed forest and open cliffside sections where the sea came into view below, gray-green and white-capped, stretching to the horizon with that absolute indifference that the sea maintained toward all human and orc concerns alike. She stopped at the first cliffside section and looked out at it. He watched her look at it. "It's very large," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I've seen the sea from Ashfin," she said. "From the docks, that's different." "Yes," he said. "The docks are the sea contained. This is the actual thing." She stood with the wind in her braid for a long moment, the red cord snapping, and her face was open in a way it wasn't often open, receiving the view without analysis. He thought she looked extraordinary. He was getting used to thinking that and trying not to let it reach his face, which was a battle he was losing incrementally. "Does it get old?" she asked, seeing it. "No," he said. "Not once." She looked at him then, the sea behind her. "I believe you," she said. And he thought she might not be talking entirely about the sea. The lighthouse at Thornwall Cape was a proper lighthouse, built of good gray stone, 40 feet from base to lantern room, perched on the southernmost point of the headland where the cape's rock jutted into the water like a pointing finger. The keeper's quarters were attached to the base, 2 rooms, a small kitchen hearth, and a narrow staircase that ran up the tower interior. It smelled of lamp oil and salt and the particular mineral cold of old stone, and when Micah unlocked the door and it swung inward on the dark interior, he had the sudden and acute awareness of seeing it with someone else's eyes for the first time. It was, objectively, a fairly austere place. "Smaller than I expected," Bula said, stepping through the doorway. "Lighthouses are generally not built for luxury," he said. "No," she agreed, looking around at the stone walls, the 2 narrow windows, the hearth that needed lighting, the pair of built-in bunks on the opposite wall. She turned and looked at the bunks. There was a particular quality to the look. "Lighthouse keepers," she said, "have more optimistic notions of personal space than I anticipated." "I usually sleep in the top one," he said. "The top one is barely a shelf," she said. "It has its advantages," he said. "You can see the lantern from it, so if the light goes out in the night, you would notice," she said. "Yes, I understand the utility." She looked at him, and there was a frankness in her expression that was warm in a way that made his chest tight. "Move to the bottom one," she said. "I'll take the top." He wanted to say that wasn't necessary, and then he thought about what it would actually feel like to lie in the bottom bunk 4 feet beneath her in the cold of the lighthouse with the beacon rotating overhead, and decided that there was no version of that arrangement in which he would sleep any better than he usually did, which was not well. "All right," he said. The first week at the lighthouse was primarily practical. There was considerable catching up to do on the lantern mechanism, which had been running on a simplified maintenance schedule during his absence and needed a thorough servicing. The storm had also done damage to the seaward face of the tower. 2 stone courses had been displaced by wave-strike impact, which was not structurally critical, but needed mortar work before deeper winter arrived. There were supply inventories to check, oil reserves to assess, the fog bell mechanism to inspect and oil. Bula threw herself into all of this without being asked. She was a competent and methodical worker, which did not surprise him. What did surprise him initially was the quality of her attention to the lighthouse itself. The way she listened when he explained the beacon's operation, asked precise questions, remembered the answers, and applied them the next time the relevant situation arose. By the end of the first week, she could trim the lighthouse flame to the correct wick height in the dark, because he had explained it once and she had filed it. By the end of the second week, she had climbed the tower's exterior to repoint the displaced stone courses herself, because the scaffolding he had was lighter than the equipment the job really needed, and her reach and upper body strength made the work considerably easier than it would have been for him alone. He watched her work from below, passing up the mortar bucket on a rope, and thought about people who fit into places. He had fit into the lighthouse. He had thought of it as a solitary fit, one person and one purpose occupying a small specific space in the world. He was discovering that the space was larger than he had mapped it. On the 12th night, the weather came in again. Not the full violence of the Thornwall storm, but a sustained gale off the sea that drove rain against the lighthouse in horizontal sheets and built the surf below the headland into something loud and present in every room of the building. Micah was in the lantern room adjusting the beacon trim when the gale's first real surge hit, and the tower swayed, not dangerously, it was built for this, but perceptibly, a slow lean into the wind and back. He heard her on the stairs. She appeared in the lantern room hatch, her hair loose from its braid, wearing only the green tunic with the bodice loosened over it, and she looked around the lantern room with wide, alert eyes and then at him, and he said immediately, "It's all right. The tower is built for this. This is nothing like a real storm." She looked at him. "I know," she said with a certain amount of dignity. "I heard the bell adjustment and came to see if you needed help." "The bell's fine," he said. "Come up, have a look." She climbed through the hatch and stood in the lantern room, which was not large. A circular space barely 8 feet across, dominated by the rotating beacon mechanism and its 4 glass panels. The windows were all sea view, and the view was spectacular in the way that weather at full expression is always spectacular. The sea below invisible in the dark except for the white lines of the surf that flashed into existence when the beacon rotated over them, and the rain on the glass, and the wind a physical presence against the tower's curved wall. She stood at the glass and looked out. He stood beside her, close in the small space, and watched the sea with her. "You do this every night," she said. "Check the trim, yes. Stand up here and look at that. Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "It's like being inside the light," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it is." She turned her head and looked at him in the turning beacon light, gold and then dark and then gold again, and he looked back, and the distance between them in the small glass room was not large. The warmth of the beacon made the lantern room the warmest place in the building on cold nights, and the warmth from her was something else, immediate and real, the heat of a person in close proximity who matters to you. She put her hand on the back of his neck, her thumb at the base of his skull, and he turned fully toward her. "I keep thinking," she said in a low voice, "about the road, about what it would have been if you had sent me south at Cradle's Pass and that had been all. I keep thinking about that too," he said. "I don't know what to do with a person like you," she said, and it wasn't complaint or confusion, it was something raw and honest. "You are very direct and very kind, and you burned a warrant with my name on it, and you are," she paused, searching for the word, "you are here. You are genuinely here. Every time I look for the performance of it, there isn't one." "There isn't," he said simply. She kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the beacon turned its slow circle in the lantern room above and below them. The sea drove itself at the headland in great dark surges, and he held her in the warm light, and thought that the lighthouse had always been the right place, and this was why. They moved down to the quarters when the rain eased, the fire already burning low in the hearth, the sound of the gale dropping to a low sustained note through the tower walls. She was warm and present and entirely real, and the world outside was wind and wave and dark, and inside there was the fire and her and the particular quality of a lighthouse at night, purposeful, bright, doing its work. And he had not in a long time felt so certain that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. In the weeks that followed, a rhythm established itself. It was the rhythm of two people who were both accustomed to solitude, and who were therefore, somewhat paradoxically, better at being alone together than most people who had never lived without company. They moved around each other in the small lighthouse quarters with an ease that grew faster than he would have predicted, negotiating the space without much discussion, because they were both people who paid attention, and neither of them needed to fill silence with noise. She maintained the exterior work on the tower. He managed the beacon and the logs. She cooked better than he did, which was not a high bar, but she did it with the same matter-of-fact competence she brought to everything, and the meals improved considerably. He kept the records and the supply accounts. She repaired the fog bell housing that had been deteriorating for 2 seasons, found the source of the leak in the seaward window, and fixed it with mortar she mixed herself. They talked a great deal on the long evenings by the fire about things large and small. She told him about the Eastern clan territories, the Orc clans that ran their own roads and their own laws in the mountains, a world that ran parallel to the Crown's world, and intersected with it only at the rough edges where commerce and conflict both happened. She told him about her mother, who had been a clan storyteller and had died of winter fever when Bula was 16, and about the leadership dispute after which she had left, which involved a clan chieftain who had decided that capable women who didn't agree with him were primarily a political liability. She told him these things without self-pity and with the candor of someone who had processed them in solitude over years and was now, for perhaps the first time, putting them into words for another person. He listened to all of it, truly listened, in the way that some people are constitutionally incapable of, because they are too busy composing their response. He had no response to compose. He just wanted to know. He told her about his own history, the northern port town he'd come from, the 3 older brothers who had taken up the family fishing operation and left him, the 4th son, to find his own trade. The lighthouse posting had been an administrative placement, the kind of job that went to men with no family claims on them and no obvious objection to solitude. He had expected to do it for a year and move on. 6 years later, the moving on had never seemed urgent enough to actually do, because the lighthouse was enough, she said. Until recently, he said. She looked at him. Recently, she repeated. You've been here a month, he said. The lighthouse has been here 6 years. I noticed the math. She reached across the table and took his hand, which she had begun to do with the unself-conscious ease of a person who has decided a thing and committed to it fully, and he turned his hand and held hers, and neither of them needed to say anything further. The response from the Territorial Commission arrived on a courier's horse in the first week of the 2nd month, which was early winter and cold enough that the courier was wrapped in so many layers he was barely recognizable as a single person. He handed over a sealed packet and a verbal message. The commission was reviewing the Ashfin Quarry labor contracts. Commissioner Halsey was the subject of a formal inquiry. The acting sheriff's report and supporting documentation were central to the inquiry record. On the subject of the warrant for Bula Bonecrusher, the Commission's response was technical in the way that bureaucratic responses are technical when they are doing their best to acknowledge that something irregular was done without precisely admitting it. The warrant had been issued on the basis of information now under review, and enforcement action was suspended pending the outcome of the Halsey inquiry. Suspended pending, not rescinded, but suspended. It was, given where they had started, considerably better than either of them had expected. They're not going to push it, Micah said, sitting with the documents spread on the table. Not with the inquiry running. Halsey can't afford the attention. Not now, Bula said. She was standing at his shoulder, reading with him. If the inquiry produces results, the warrant may be dropped formally. It will, he said. The documentation is solid. I made sure of it. She looked at the documents. She looked at him. She said without preface, I used to leave. What? He said. When situations resolved themselves, she said. When there was no immediate reason to stay, I left. It was a habit. She looked at the hearth fire. From the clan, you don't stay in a place that has shown you the door once. I understand that, he said. I'm not leaving, she said. It was direct and unceremonious, the way everything she said was direct and unceremonious, as though she had examined the words, found them accurate, and saw no reason to dress them up. I want you to know that. I'm not going to wake up one morning and decide the situation has resolved and therefore I should go. That is not what this is. She met his eyes. This is something else. He stood up from the table. He was very much more than he thought he would be about things since she had arrived. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes that had been reading him since the first morning against the granite outcropping. And this time what they held was something that she was not controlling or parceling out or verifying. It was open, full, the kind of want that comes from a person who has been careful for a long time about what they let themselves want, and has finally stopped. He kissed her first this time. She responded immediately and thoroughly and pulled him close by the front of his coat. And for a while the documents on the table and the commission's bureaucratic non-rescindment and the winter outside the window were all equally irrelevant, which seemed to him like the appropriate order of priorities. The third month brought a development neither of them had anticipated. A messenger came up the Cape Road on a cold afternoon, not a crown courier, but a private hire, a weathered horseman who asked for Bula Bonecrusher by name, and when she appeared at the lighthouse door and looked at him with an expression of patient readiness for bad news, handed her a leather packet, and said it was from a clan elder in the Eastern Range. Then he turned his horse and left without elaborating, because private hire messengers at this price point were not in the business of elaborating. Bula took the packet inside and opened it at the table. Micah sat across from her and waited. She read for a long time. Her face did not change, but the quality of its stillness changed, the way a river's surface changes over different depth water. Finally, she looked up. The man who ran the quarry labor network at Ashfin, she said. The direct operator, not Halsey, the man Halsey contracted. His name is Drev Caro. He was not a crown official. He was a private contractor. She set the letter down. He's been running contracts through the Eastern Clan territories for 4 years. The elder who wrote this, she tapped the letter, his name is Sorkin Fang. He was my mother's brother. I haven't spoken to him in 8 years. She paused. He says Caro has put out a private bounty on me through the road networks. Not a crown warrant, a bounty. She looked at Micah. He says 3 hunters accepted it. He's seen them on the eastern road heading west. The silence in the lighthouse had a different quality now. How long? Micah said. Sorkin sent this letter 6 days ago by fast horse. If the hunters were a day behind him, she calculated. 5 days, maybe 4. They'd come up the Pilgrim Road, he said. It's the only approach to the Cape that's not cliff face. Yes, she said. He stood up. He went to the window and looked out at the Cape Road, which was empty in the winter light, a pale ribbon of stone running up from the clifftop path to the lighthouse yard. Then he turned back. 3 bounty hunters, he said, coming to the lighthouse. Coming for me, she corrected. Coming to the lighthouse, he said again, evenly. She looked at him. Something in her eyes shifted the calculation that was always running there, the one that had been assessing threats and making escape plans and trusting no one's continued support since she was 16, suddenly running against a variable it didn't know what to do with, which was a man who corrected the framing of coming for me to coming to the lighthouse and meant it. Micah, she said. 3 is manageable, he said. We know the ground. The Cape has 1 road, and the lighthouse has stone walls and a very good vantage point from the lantern room. He was already moving to the storage chest under the built-in bunk, pulling out the short iron crossbow he kept for maritime emergencies and the heavy bolts that went with it. "And there are two of us." "I could go," she said. "If I leave tonight, move fast." "No," he said. He said it without anger, without performance, just flatly and finally. He looked at her. "No, you are not going anywhere, Bula, not from here." A pause. "I need you to understand that this is not negotiable." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Nobody has ever said that to me before." "I know," he said, and held her gaze until she nodded. They prepared. The lighthouse, once Micah thought about it with the specific pragmatism of a man who had spent years preparing for maritime emergencies, was actually a defensible position. The tower itself was solid stone with a single interior staircase and a single exterior door, which could be barred from within with a crossbeam that would require serious equipment to breach. The lantern room gave height and a 360-degree view of every approach. The Cape's cliff-face geography meant that the only viable approach for multiple people was indeed the road, which funneled anything coming toward them into a single visible line. Bula contributed to the planning with the tactical fluency of someone who had, apparently, thought about survival scenarios with some regularity. She assessed the stable attached to the lighthouse, which had been built for supply horses, as a potential concealment point for an ambush, identified the blind corner of the lighthouse's north face as the best approach cover for anyone who knew what they were doing, and observed that bounty hunters who took jobs on behalf of a road network contractor were almost never as disciplined as soldiers. "They'll come at night," she said. "Bounty hunters always prefer night arrival. It's instinct, even when it's not tactically superior." "So we don't sleep," he said. "We sleep in shifts," she said. "I'll take the lantern room watch. I can see the road from there." They ate a substantial meal because she was pragmatic about the body's needs and pointed out that if they were going to spend the night awake, they should not do it hungry. Then she took the lantern room and he slept 2 hours in the bottom bunk with the crossbow loaded beside him, and when she came down and put her hand on his shoulder, he was instantly awake. "Road," she said. 3 figures, coming slow, no horses. He was on his feet before she finished. They came at the 3rd hour after midnight, which was the deepest part of the night, when even the gale had dropped to a low moan off the sea. 3 men, moving in the specific way of people who think they are being quiet, which is noticeably different from people who actually are quiet. They came along the Cape Road and split at the lighthouse yard gate, 1 forward, 2 circling the north face, which was exactly the approach Bula had predicted. She was already at the north face blind corner, not inside. Outside. She had gone out the side window 20 minutes before the hunters arrived, moving through the dark with the natural and unsettling silence of a person who had grown up in mountain terrain and had never lost the ability to move through dark spaces with her body rather than her eyes. Micah opened the front door. He stepped out into the yard with the badge on his chest and the crossbow in his hands, and he said, in a clear and carrying voice, "Cradles Pass, acting sheriff. This is a lighthouse under Crown operational jurisdiction. State your business or turn back." The man coming forward stopped. He was broad, professional, wearing road-weathered clothes and carrying a short sword. He looked at the badge. He looked at the crossbow. "We're here for the orc woman," he said. "She's under the protection of a Crown officer conducting an active inquiry," Micah said, "which makes any attempt on her person interference with Crown business. That's a hanging offense in 2 of the 3 territories." He kept the crossbow level. "I'd suggest you think carefully about whether the bounty is worth it." A silence. Then from the north face of the tower, a short, sharp sound of impact, a grunt, and the specific sound of someone losing a serious physical argument very quickly. Then silence. Then Bula came around the corner of the lighthouse, with the knife out and 2 men's worth of attitude absolutely absent from the proceeding, and the 3rd man at the front of the yard looked at her and then at Micah, and then at the crossbow and decided rapidly. He ran. The 2 men on the north face were not badly injured, but they were thoroughly discouraged and would require the better part of an hour to collect themselves from the position they had found themselves in. Bula looked entirely unruffled. There was a small cut on her jaw and her braid had come half out, but other than that she looked like someone who had handled an inconvenient errand. Micah put the crossbow down. He walked over to her in the dark yard with the sea below and the beacon rotating above them, throwing its light in long sweeping passes across the water, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and then she stepped forward and put her forehead against his and just breathed for a moment, and he put his arms around her and held on. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you are." "You were very official," she said. "It worked," he pointed out. "The look on his face," she said, and her voice had that warmth in it, the barely contained amusement. "When you said hanging a fence, I was not entirely certain that was accurate," he admitted, "but it sounded authoritative." She laughed, fully this time, against his shoulder, and he felt it through his chest and his arms and all the way down, and he held her tighter and laughed too, quietly, into her hair, because they were alive and the night was cold and the lighthouse was still there, and that was all that it needed to be. He bound the 2 remaining hunters with rope from the stable and left them in the yard until morning, when they would be sober enough for a proper accounting. He sent a written account of the incident to the Territorial Commission as a supplement to the ongoing Halsey inquiry, which noted the attempted intimidation of a witness material to a commission investigation, and named Drev Caro explicitly. The investigation was not going to be able to ignore that. It would become a much more serious document with bounty hunters in it. 2 weeks later, the commission sent a formal notification. The inquiry had been expanded to include Drev Caro's network. The warrant for Bula Bonecrusher was formally and officially rescinded, on the grounds that the action for which it had been issued had been determined to be. The language was extraordinary in its careful construction, a disruption of an unlawful labor scheme, not a violation of Crown property laws. Halsey was suspended from his commissioner's post pending further proceedings. The notification arrived in the morning and Micah read it at the table with his breakfast cooling beside him, and then he looked up at Bula, who was standing at the hearth with a cup of tea, watching him. "It's done," he said. She put the tea down. She crossed the room. She sat across from him and looked at the document, and then she looked at him and she said, "Done. The warrant is rescinded, formally, on record." He held her eyes. "You are not a fugitive." She was very still for a moment. Then she reached out and took his hand, both of hers around it, and held it on the table, and she didn't say anything for a while, and he didn't need her to. The lighthouse at Thornwall Cape had a particular quality in the mornings when the weather was clear, and the sea ran calm and the night's fog had burned off, leaving the air transparent and brilliant. Light did a specific thing in those conditions on the southern headland, bouncing off the water and up the cliff face and into the lantern room's windows, so that the whole tower seemed to be incandescent from inside, lit by the sea itself rather than by any flame within it. Micah had described it to very few people because it was the kind of thing that resisted description. You could say the light was beautiful and be accurate but useless. You had to see it. He watched Bula see it, on the first clear morning after the notification arrived. She had climbed to the lantern room, which had become a habit of hers in the mornings, to look at the sea, she said, to verify that it was still improbably large. He had gone up behind her and found her standing at the glass, and the reflected sea light was all around her, turning the green of her skin warm and the black of her hair bright, catching on the curves of her tusks and the edges of her eyes, and she was facing away from him, looking out, and she was utterly and unguardedly beautiful in the morning light, and he had been in love with her for a while already, but the morning light made it impossible to be any longer unclear about its precise extent. He said her name. She turned. He said, "Stay." He did not mean it as a question exactly, but he offered it as one, with a person's full awareness that the right to say yes had to be genuinely present or the yes meant nothing. She looked at him in the sea light. She looked at the lantern room and the view and the lighthouse they were standing in, And then she looked at him again, and what was in her face was everything. The wariness she had been carrying for the better part of her life, and the want that had been accumulating since a cold morning on the Pilgrim Road when a man had looked at a warrant with her name on it and decided to think about what it actually said. All of it at once. "Where would I go?" she said. And it was not evasion. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to him, which was remarkable because she was a very honest person. She meant, "You are where I am. This is where I am. The lighthouse is where I am because you are here and I am not going anywhere." He crossed the lantern room and held her face the way she had held his on the Pilgrim Road, both hands carefully, and he said, "Good, that's settled then." She turned her head slightly, pressing her mouth to his palm, and then looked at him. "Settled," she agreed. She kissed him first this time, which was how it often went, because she was a decisive person. He kissed her back thoroughly, there in the sea light with the beacon still, and the view of the ocean enormous and indifferent beyond the glass, and neither of them was thinking about warrants or bounties or commissioners or the Pilgrim Road, because none of those things were in the room. What was in the room was exactly sufficient. A year is not a long time in the life of a lighthouse, which has been keeping its light for decades and will continue to do so after everyone who tends it is gone. But in the life of two people who have each spent most of their years in a solitude that was sometimes by choice and sometimes not, a year can be a very full and specific thing. By the time autumn came around again, the lighthouse had 2 sets of boot marks worn into the stone threshold, and the supply manifest had expanded to include items that Micah, living alone, had never bothered to maintain. There was a second axe in the stable, next to the lighthouse axe, and a set of road leathers hanging on the peg beside his coat that were not his. The kitchen was better supplied. The window that had leaked was watertight. The fog bell mechanism ran in better condition than it had in 4 years. The stone courses on the seaward face were mortared properly for the first time since anyone could remember. The Territorial Commission completed its inquiry and determined formal findings. Halsey was removed from his position permanently and faced civil penalties under the Pilgrim Road Charter. Drev Caro was charged under territorial labor laws for operating an unlawful contract scheme. The inquiry records cited the acting sheriff's documentation from Cradle's Pass as foundational evidence, which was a phrasing that Micah found quietly satisfying in the way that good work acknowledged is always satisfying. Micah received a formal offer to continue as a full-time sheriff for the Pilgrim Road jurisdiction, operating from the Cradle's Pass Wayhouse on a permanent basis. He thought about it for 2 days, and then he turned it down in a politely worded letter that thanked the commission for its confidence and explained that his skills were better applied in his current role. He had been offered the same lighthouse contract renewal that he had accepted every 2 years for 6 years, and he was accepting it again. He enclosed with the letter a secondary document proposing a formal arrangement by which the lighthouse could serve as a communication relay point for the Road Charter Authority, a proposal that had been Bula's idea and was the kind of practical, mutually beneficial arrangement that bureaucracies tended to accept because it cost them nothing and gave them something useful. The commission accepted the proposal within a fortnight. Bula read the commission's acceptance letter at the table and said, without looking up, "So we work for the commission now." "The lighthouse does," he said, "as a relay point. And you kept the lighthouse posting." "Yes." "You turned down the sheriff's position." She looked up, not disapproving, something else. "The lighthouse needs a keeper," he said. "I know how to keep it. I know how to write thorough reports. I know this headland." He looked at her. "And everything I want is here." She held his gaze for a long, specific moment. Then she stood and walked around the table, and he turned in his chair to face her, and she stood in front of him with her hand at his jaw and her thumb along his cheekbone, and she said, "I love you, Micah Winslow." She said it with the same directness and precision that she brought to everything, no excess, nothing wasted, no hedging. Just the truth, stated plainly because it was the truth. He put his hand over hers. "I love you," he said, in the same plain way, because they were both people who found plainness more trustworthy than decoration, and because it was simply, completely, and without qualification true. She leaned down and pressed her mouth to his, warm and deliberate, and he pulled her close and held her there. And outside the lighthouse the autumn sea ran gray and cold and impervious, and the beacon would begin its rotation at dusk, as it did every evening, turning its light in long, slow sweeps across the dark water to guide whatever needed guiding home. There was a particular evening, not long after, when the two of them sat on the headland rock above the lighthouse, in the last hour of light before he needed to climb and trim the beacon for the night. The sky was the specific color of late autumn over the water, amber and gray rose, the horizon beginning to haze. She sat with her shoulder against his, her braid down, the red cord loose in the wind, and he had his arm around her and she had her hand on his knee, and they were watching the sea do the thing it did every evening at this hour, which was turn the light into something that looked less like physics and more like intent. "Last autumn," she said, "I was on the Pilgrim Road with a warrant on my head and nowhere to go. Last autumn," he said, "I was going to leave for the lighthouse in 3 days and never think about Cradle's Pass again." "And then," she said. "And then," he agreed. She turned and looked at him in the evening light, fully and without the assessment calculation that had been there in the beginning, just her, open and warm and present. "A man who keeps a light," she said. "A woman who frees the locked," he said. She smiled at that, a real and unguarded smile, which was one of the several things in the world that still managed to stop his breath a little, even now. She leaned in and kissed his jaw, the corner of his mouth, and he turned and kissed her back properly, her hand coming to the back of his neck, the warmth of her a complete and present fact in the cooling air. Below them, the sea moved in its old and indifferent way. Above them, in the lantern room, the beacon waited to begin its turning. Between them there was nothing unclosed, nothing unresolved, nothing that needed to be different from what it was. He had spent 6 years keeping a light for ships he never saw and people he never met, because the light was necessary and someone had to maintain it, and he was, it turned out, suited for necessary things done faithfully in solitude. He had thought that was the shape of his life. He had been doing the same work for a year now, the same light, the same headland, the same cold sea. The shape was the same. Everything inside it was different. She pulled back and looked at him, her eyes warm and steady. "We should get the beacon lit," she said. "We should," he agreed. They stood together from the rock, and she went first down the path to the lighthouse door, and he followed, and she held the door for him, and they went inside to light the lamp.